Okay, I want to talk about intermittent fasting, low carb diets, and calories in and calories out. So, a bit of a disclaimer, this is still something I'm figuring out for myself. I'm sort of taking notes on what has and hasn't worked for me in the past and testing it out from there. So, where I'm at now with this whole idea of, is there an optimum diet we should follow, or is it just macros? I think, to my understanding, there's no right answer. They're all different vehicles we can pick depending on what works for us. And I think, for me at this stage, it's probably a mix of intermittent fasting, low carb, and calories. And what I'll explain by that, what I mean by that is what I'll explain in a second. So when I first sort of got into fitness, I was naturally drawn to keto and low carb. I've always been a very avid enjoyer of meat and protein, and the idea of needing to control that was not great. So I think when I first got into fitness, it was actually a lot of cheap, fatty cuts of steak and ground beef. And the funny thing is, what I didn't realize at the time was that even though I'm eating a clean, whole foods based diet, I'm still overshooting my calories every single day. And that took a while to get my head around. So after that, I discovered keto and low carb, had a couple of friends who had really good experience doing it, and so I dove into that. Instinctively, I had a good, strong gut feeling that eating cheese and bacon every day probably wasn't going to be good for me. And so I went into a whole foods, clean keto approach where I was trying to eat a lot of fatty cuts of meat and vegetables and that sort of thing. And I had some pretty good experience doing that. I did that on and off for about 2 years and did lose a bit of weight, maybe 10 kilos, saw a visible difference in my body composition, but ultimately it was unsustainable. I started having, energy crashes and FOMO and that sort of thing. So I did keto for about a good 1 to 2 years, had a break, came back, did it again, but I also implemented intermittent fasting, which I wasn't doing super consistently, but I did find helped a little bit more. Throughout this whole process, I was very adverse to working out. A big thing about me, I never identified as like a sporty dude, and the idea of being in a gym for 45 minutes every second or third day was like awful to me. I was like, I can't imagine doing that. So I was adamant that I was going to do this, and I was going to do it without working out and just working on my diet, because I had this idea in my head that, there's loads of people who don't work out and they're healthy, so why should I have to do it? Which was totally wrong. So anyways, leading up to that, on and off with keto again, and I'd always have the same thing of some initial benefit, but then ultimately crashing and burning, getting sick of it, getting sick of the texture and not being able to, eat. So, sorry, itchy eyes. So anyways, after a while, I kind of gave up on all that and just lived, and still ate relatively healthy, but didn't have any change in my body composition or health. And from there started working with a coach and a PT who also I think had a similar experience based on what he kind of worked on me with. I could tell that he might have come from a bit of a keto background as well, but simplified it and brought in this whole calories thing, which was huge. So now where I'm at, I am trying to optimize it to a point where I am fasting so that I can control my insulin, and then for most of the day stick to a low carb diet, eat carbs in the evening or around workouts, and try and keep things relatively whole foods. I mean, at the moment, a typical day for me will, involve maybe some fatty to lean cuts of steak, ground beef or mincemeat as we call it in Australia, chicken breast, leafy greens, salad, that sort of thing, avocado. As far as, Greek yogurt, as far as processed foods, I think the most processed food I eat at the moment is probably protein powder, if that counts. Try and get my sweet treat from like dark chocolate and fruits and berries and that sort of thing. And then, carb wise is a tricky one, because I do think there's probably a benefit in not eating carbs, but I just think from a sustainability point, I have to include them. So it's just about trying to maintain the portion size and the macros, like instead of having a regular bowl of like rice with whatever you're having, I have like maybe half a cup. If I'm having pasta, it's like I just double the protein and maybe throw some extra veggies in depending on what I'm eating. So yeah, I'd say right now what I'm following in an ideal day is, we don't eat breakfast, maybe have lunch at like 11 to 1 p.m. Then I just kind of eat intuitively but track my calories. And then usually have some carbs with dinner. If I do feel like having a bit of an indulgent treat, I'm actually getting these protein cheesecakes from the supermarket, which 200 calories, 20 grams of protein, not bad if you need that sweet treat. But, I'm just trying to like exercise a lot of mindfulness in what I'm doing. If I am going to eat some ice cream with some friends, like I'm going to have like 2 teaspoons and just shut it off. Because what I've realized is, and maybe you'll realize this too, is once you have those first 1 to 2 teaspoons of ice cream or cake or whatever it is, it's like you don't get that much more pleasure out of it. Have you realized that? Or is that just me? I think you'll realize it. Like at some point, maybe you're eating a bucket of fried chicken, or you're eating French fries or potato chips or whatever it is. You're going to have, I'm going to say, to simplify, like a small handful, or like a teaspoon. And you're going to get that initial enjoyment and dopamine, but then eventually you're just kind of going to be following this empty craving. I think I am, at least. I don't know, for me, it's like I could totally smash a whole pint of ice cream, but the level of enjoyment I get from that is not going to be much different from like 3 teaspoons. So a bit of a kooky one to end that with, but I think there's a lot of benefit in trying to be aware of your food habits. I'm guilty of it. I'm guilty of eating dinner in front of the telly. Who calls it the telly nowadays? But anyways, the TV or a podcast or whatever. And there's times where I think I can do that and I can indulge in that practice pretty safely if I'm eating like a chicken salad or whatever. But if I'm having something that's quite calorie dense or, isn't exactly kosher within the realms of my diet, I think that's where we should really try and clock onto those patterns. So yeah, just a bit of a brief one talking about my diet today because I was thinking about that. I don't know. I'm still not set on whether it matters as much whether you're doing keto, carnivore, vegan, low carb or whatever, or low calorie, as much as just being consistent. So yeah.